when a lone royal staffer leaked whispers of an unrecorded midnight ceremony inside Windsor Castle, no one knew whether to believe it or fear it. But the phrase that would set fire to every corner of the monarchy had already been uttered: "She is the future." And those 4 words didn't just change Catherine's destiny, they shattered Camilla's. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with an eerie silence. Buckingham Palace, typically a fortress of tight-lipped composure, gave nothing away. No public schedule changes, no official photographs, and yet, behind closed doors, something was stirring. Something that made even the most seasoned palace aides uneasy. Royal watchers began noticing irregularities. A fleet of unmarked vehicles departing from Kensington in the dead of night. A sudden blackout of press access around Windsor and the unmistakable tightening of palace security. And then came the whispers, faint but charged. A midnight meeting, a handover, a shift in power that was too monumental to be public, yet too permanent to remain hidden forever. Those whispers quickly turned into suspicion when Catherine, Princess of Wales, was seen slipping into Windsor Castle just before midnight, alone, her face unreadable, her car unaccompanied by usual pageantry. Observers noted her attire simple, but said to be laden with ancestral symbolism, garments rarely seen outside of deeply traditional ceremonies. Meanwhile, King Charles's personal valet was overheard, uttering a cryptic line to a senior footman. "Tonight is an irreversible gesture." That line alone sent shock waves through the inner corridors of the royal estate. What was about to occur that required such finality? While this unfolded, Queen Camilla's conspicuous absence became another puzzle piece. She was scheduled to attend a high-profile diplomatic dinner at Clarence House, a rare occasion where her presence was not only expected, but vital. And yet she never arrived. Insiders later confirmed she was informed of the private event only hours before it took place, and not by Charles, but through a secondary aide. For Camilla, the silence wasn't just exclusion. It was humiliation cloaked in protocol. Inside Windsor, sources allege a chamber was prepared. Not just any chamber, but the same one once used by Queen Elizabeth during key transition moments of her reign. Candles were lit, ancient items from the royal archives brought forth. This wasn't a briefing. This wasn't even a strategic meeting. It was a legacy transfer, and at the center of it stood Charles, poised to deliver something no one, especially Camilla, ever expected. The symbolic future of the monarchy bestowed not to his queen, but to his son's wife. It wasn't supposed to be public. But when history is being rewritten in real time, secrets refuse to stay buried. Because what truly happened behind those locked doors would come to light only after one phrase ignited a royal storm whispered by the monarch himself just before he bent the knee. In a monarchy where bowing is symbolic of power, King Charles's decision to kneel before his daughter-in-law was more than ceremonial. It was revolutionary. For a man who had waited a lifetime for the crown, what could compel such a dramatic reversal? And what did it mean for Camilla, the woman who had once stood beside him through scandal and rise? The moment came without fanfare, without horns, and without the heavy footsteps of tradition. It came in quiet inside the sacred stone halls of Windsor, under the gaze of ancestral portraits and the silence of history. King Charles dropped to one knee, not for a sovereign, not for a state, but for Catherine. Eyewitness leaks, still sparingly whispered among inner circles, described a moment that left the room breathless. Charles, holding a folded royal sash between his fingers, placed one hand over his heart, and the other extended it toward the Princess of Wales. Then, with barely a tremble in his voice, he spoke the words no monarch in living memory had ever uttered to someone not yet crowned. "She is the future." It was not a public statement. It was not performed for cameras or pageantry. It was deliberate, raw, and deeply symbolic. The act of kneeling shattered every precedent Charles had once been expected to uphold. For decades, he had endured ridicule, resistance, and reinvention just to wear the crown. And yet here he was, offering something greater than title legacy. In that kneel, he was not just a king. He was a man choosing continuity over pride, stability over entitlement. And at the center of that decision stood Catherine, neither demanding nor denying, but accepting a role etched by destiny rather than design. In his hand, Charles held a small velvet pouch containing an heirloom long hidden from public view, a deep sapphire pin once worn by Queen Elizabeth Roman II during private council sessions, a token never listed in any official inventory. With careful precision, Charles fastened it onto Catherine's dress, symbolically passing the quiet strength of his late mother to the woman he now believed embodied the monarchy's moral compass. The act was not rehearsed. It was reverent. It was irreversible. One adviser present reportedly wiped tears from his eyes. Another, too stunned to speak, simply bowed his head, and Catherine, she stood still, tears in her eyes, her posture graceful, her silence louder than any proclamation. Those watching understood instantly what had occurred. One senior figure compared it to Queen Elizabeth I's coronation declaration, calling it a private crowning of spirit, not crown. The only other voices in the room were those of 3 deeply trusted advisers and 1 archbishop, handpicked for their loyalty and silence. There were no cameras, no transcripts, no announcements. But what had been set into motion could not be contained because what happened within those stone walls was never meant to stay there. Power once shifted echoes louder than any royal decree, and this echo would soon become a reckoning. But as Charles handed over more than words, the woman kept furthest from the room was already unraveling, and what she learned next would break her. When Camilla heard the echoes of what had taken place, she demanded clarity and got betrayal. Her fury was immediate, her heartbreak uncontainable. A queen consort shut out, a future sealed without her, and a husband she no longer recognized. It was all too much. The morning after the secret ceremony, Camilla stormed through the halls of Clarence House with an expression aides would later describe as ghost-like, pale, breathless, and shaking. She demanded to see Charles pushing past stunned staff who had yet to receive a briefing. She found him in his private study, reviewing documents with a calm that felt cruel in contrast. The moment she entered, the silence broke. "You've crowned her already," she cried, her voice cutting through centuries of royal tradition. Charles didn't deny it. Instead, he simply looked up and said, "It had to be done." That reply, curt, final, cold, wasn't just an admission. It was a dismissal, and Camilla knew it. Within hours, the palace was gripped by disarray. Staff exchanged glances, but dared not speak aloud what everyone was thinking. A coup had unfolded, not by force, but by emotion. Camilla, once the woman Charles had fought the world to defend, was now the outsider. Aides close to her said she retreated to the blue drawing room, where she sat alone for over 2 hours trembling. She made no phone calls, she took no visitors, she stared at the fire and said nothing. When her ladies-in-waiting finally entered, they found her clutching a frame, one that held a portrait of her and Charles taken on the day of the coronation. Moments later, that same frame was hurled across the floor, shattering into pieces. For the first time since assuming her title, Camilla felt not just excluded, but erased. Word began spreading to her closest confidants. Some were outraged, others stunned into silence, but all agreed on one truth. Camilla had not been consulted, invited, or informed. Not even a symbolic role had been offered. It was as if her chapter had already ended, and no one had the courtesy to write her a final line. Even her most loyal allies admitted the exclusion felt intentional. Was this Charles's silent way of correcting the past? Was this his atonement delivered at the cost of Camilla's pride? Among the most haunting revelations came from a private diary entry later, leaked to a trusted journalist. In her own handwriting, Camilla had once penned, "No matter the crown I wear, my legacy will be that of the last great queen." The ink was dated just 3 months before the ceremony. The words, once brimming with certainty, now echoed with irony, because while she believed she would be the final royal woman to hold true power, The truth had moved on without her. And in this silence, one thing stood out even more: the calculated absence of Princess Anne and Prince Edward. Both were known for their strategic neutrality, but this time their silence spoke volumes. Neither had stood beside Charles. Neither had stood beside Camilla. It was a message cloaked in royal restraint. They had chosen to stay away, to distance themselves from the emotional eruption they knew would come. The monarchy, it seemed, was preparing for a future. Camilla was never meant to reach. And as the royal household scrambled to contain the emotional fallout, one image began circulating, one that would turn public sympathy in a new shocking direction. A single photo leaked, grainy but unmistakable. Catherine standing beneath Queen Elizabeth's crest, wearing the brooch last seen on Her Majesty in her final days. Just a silent declaration of continuity that sparked fury from Camilla's side and a wave of reverence from the public. The image swept across the internet like wildfire, first appearing in a fringe royal watcher forum before being picked up by global outlets within the hour. The timing was damning, just as the palace scrambled to contain the emotional aftershocks of Camilla's confrontation with Charles. Here was photographic proof of what had taken place in Windsor's hidden chamber, a single frame that spoke more than any press release could. It was Catherine, solemn and motionless, wearing the Queen's brooch, one rarely seen in public, but deeply symbolic among royal insiders. It wasn't just jewelry. It was power cloaked in tradition, a mark of female sovereignty passed down through whispers, not votes. The brooch had always been different. Elizabeth had worn it during private audiences, during moments where decisions carried generational weight. It had never been flaunted, never loaned, and never included in official displays. It was a symbol of her personal authority, her judgment, and her quiet dominance. And now there it was, resting on Catherine's shoulder. The message wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The visual alone delivered the blow. Elizabeth's legacy had found its heir, and it wasn't Camilla. Sources inside the palace confirmed the photo was taken mere minutes after the private meal. Catherine had not posed. There was no grandeur, no visible triumph in her expression. She looked tired, weighted, regal, not as a victor, but as a woman absorbing the full weight of a dynasty's expectation. But while her composure captivated the public, Camilla's inner circle was enraged. They claimed the leak was strategic, a manipulative, premeditated move to seal public favor while Camilla was still reeling. The Queen Consort's allies moved quickly, attempting to discredit the timing, even suggesting the photo was altered. But the damage was already done. Social media exploded. The hashtags began to trend globally. Number Queen in waiting. Number Elizabeth's choice. Number the future is Catherine. Public sentiment, once cautiously respectful of Camilla's place, shifted almost overnight. Comparisons were drawn. Editorials emerged. Catherine's name began appearing alongside Elizabeth's in headlines, not focused on resemblance or role, but succession. She was no longer the Princess of Wales. She was something more, something inevitable, and the public felt it before the Crown ever confirmed it. Behind palace doors, an internal report was swiftly drafted. Its language was direct, uncharacteristically blunt for royal documentation. It read, the brooch image marked a shift in public narrative. From legacy to future, from Camilla to Catherine, we are no longer guiding the transition. We are reacting to it. The phrase itself would later be referenced by multiple insiders as the moment the tides turned. For Camilla, the brooch represented something deeper than symbolism. It was the confirmation of what she feared, that she had been bypassed in the eyes of history, and worse, that the world had already accepted it. The silence from the palace press office only deepened her isolation. No denial, no clarification, just the quiet, echoing truth of an image too powerful to ignore. But even more shocking than the brooch was what surfaced next, a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth herself, sealed and hidden until now, locked in a chest and marked to be opened upon appropriate fulfillment. The Queen's final letter to Catherine had never been intended for public eyes. But as tensions escalated and loyalties fractured, its contents would leak and shatter everything Camilla thought she inherited. The letter had remained untouched for years, tucked within the private vaults of Windsor, protected by layers of protocol and guarded by only a handful of trusted senior royals. It was Queen Elizabeth's own doing, a personal instruction penned in the final year of her reign, not addressed to the monarchy, not to the people, not even to Charles. It was meant for one recipient only, Catherine, and its delivery, according to the late Queen's command, was to occur only when the moment arrived, not of convenience, but of confirmation. That moment, as fate would have it, came days after Charles's private kneel and the brooch's public reveal. The monarchy, in spirit, if not in law, had already chosen its next guiding force. All that remained was the Queen's own voice to bless what the world was already beginning to accept. It was Princess Anne who carried the sealed letter into Kensington Palace, not with ceremony, not with a procession, but with solemn purpose. Eyewitnesses say Catherine received it in silence, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she recognized the monogram, a single E in royal blue ink underscored by the sovereign's crest. For over 2 hours, Catherine did not emerge from her study. Staff respected the silence. No messages were delivered. No doors were opened. When she did reappear, her eyes were swollen but resolute. Something had shifted less like a burden received and more like a truth confirmed. What lay inside the letter would later be verified through leaks, journalistic investigations, and internal palace correspondences that were never meant for the public. But as with all things royal and sacred, the walls eventually whispered. Queen Elizabeth's words, handwritten in steady lines, began with grace. To Catherine, whom I've watched with care and quiet trust, the letter did not speak of succession or titles. It didn't lay out strategy or command. Instead, it captured something deeper, a legacy passed through character, not crown. And then came the line that shook the monarchy: "She will be the crown's calm when storms rise." 6 words that echoed like scripture. But more telling than what the Queen wrote was what she didn't. Nowhere in the letter was Camilla mentioned. Not once. The omission was deafening, and for Camilla, still reeling from exclusion, it confirmed what she had feared but never voiced. She had been bypassed not just in action, but in the late Queen's foresight. Elizabeth had seen the storm coming, and she had chosen who would steady the crown when it hit. The letter's existence alone became a lightning rod. Palace officials scrambled to control the narrative, issuing vague acknowledgments without denying its contents. But the press pounced. Headlines crowned it a spiritual anointing beyond the throne. Public fascination turned into emotional allegiance. Catherine wasn't being positioned. She had already been appointed long before anyone realized. She wasn't simply rising. She had always been the intended anchor, and with this letter, the monarchy's silent shift became impossible to deny. What began as a whisper behind closed doors had become a decree written in the Queen's own hand. And as the message from the late monarch converged with the gesture from the current king, one woman's rise became undeniable, and another's desperation pushed her toward confrontation. Determined to reclaim her place, Camilla stormed into the royal council chamber and demanded answers. But what she received instead was silence, and from Catherine something worse, unshakable calm. It was not a scheduled meeting. Camilla's summons came without protocol, without clearance, and without patience. She entered the room like a storm breaking through stained glass, fury barely held beneath her crown. Inside sat Charles, William, Princess Anne, and 2 senior advisors all waiting, but not for her. Camilla didn't hesitate. She turned to Charles first, her voice low but quivering with restrained rage, and asked the question that had been rotting inside her since the ceremony. Was it symbolic or binding? Her tone left no space for niceties, no room for deference. This wasn't a queen seeking clarity. This was a woman fighting for survival. The room held its breath. Charles, for a moment, avoided her gaze. Then he stood, adjusted the cuffs of his sleeve, and said what would become the final nail in a fractured crown. "It is the path we've chosen. No elaboration, no comfort, just a sentence that signaled not just acceptance, but decision. The implication hit her harder than any headline. Camilla wasn't part of the path, she was the deed, where they'd chosen to leave behind. William remained composed throughout the exchange, firm yet distant. His loyalty to Catherine was unmistakable, and so was his unwillingness to plate Camilla's unraveling authority. When she turned to him, searching for support, perhaps even a hint of empathy, she received only a courteous nod, nothing more. It was Anne, however, who delivered the harshest blow without saying a single word, arms crossed, her face unreadable. She didn't look at Camilla once. In a family ruled by silence, Anne's silence was damning, and then came Catherine. She entered the chamber deliberately late, a move that some would later call strategic, others instinctive. No one greeted her, no one needed to. She didn't apologize for her timing. She didn't justify her presence. She simply acknowledged the council with calm dignity and took her seat. Camilla's eyes locked onto her, desperate for an explanation, a reaction, anything that could be challenged. But what she found in Catherine's eyes was devastating. Not arrogance, not pity, but peace. The kind of peace that only comes with acceptance, with inevitability. The conversation that followed was brief and clinical. Camilla demanded statements, reversals, clarifications. No one gave her any, not even Charles. The weight of her exclusion settled into the room like dust, final and unclean. And when it became clear that no one would fight for her, that no one would even argue on her behalf, she stood slowly, straightened her coat, and whispered as she passed the threshold. "Then I am nothing." No one followed her. What should have been her chamber of authority had become a room of ghosts. Loyalty past, loyalty present, and loyalty already pledged elsewhere. Camilla didn't slam the door. She didn't scream. She left it open behind her as if daring them to call her back. No one did. But before Camilla could retreat into exile, one more twist awaited an ancient royal ritual quietly revived in Catherine's honor. Revived from deep royal history, the ritual of the circle hadn't been seen since the days of Victoria. But when Catherine stepped into the garden, flanked by 3 royal women, the message was unmistakable. She was now the central force. For more than a century, the ceremony had been lost to time, buried beneath modernity and political reform, considered too archaic for a monarchy that had long since traded myth for media. But tradition, when wielded with precision, becomes power. So when invitations were quietly extended to a select group of nobles, dignitaries, and deeply trusted press, the palace offered no explanation. No titles were announced, no declarations made, only a name, the Circle. By the time the garden gates opened, anticipation had already eclipsed protocol. At the heart of the ritual stood Catherine, but she did not stand alone. To her right, Princess Anne, stoic, immovable, history personified. To her left, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, graceful and quiet, a symbol of loyalty through storm and scandal. And behind her, Zara Tyndall, unofficial in title, but royal in blood, representing the bridge between tradition and the modern era. Together, they formed the living embodiment of legacy, strength, and evolution. Their presence was no accident. Their formation no coincidence. This was not a coronation. It was a silent reordering of the royal constellation. The air shifted when Catherine began to speak. Her voice did not shake, it did not rise, it simply held. Every word deliberate, every pause designed to linger in the collective memory of a family and a nation grappling with change. To hold when others break, to lead when others fall, it was not a promise, it was a verdict, a vow not of entitlement, but of endurance. As the final syllable faded into the garden air, an attendant stepped forward, carrying a velvet box older than any present. Inside, nestled in history and dust, lay a ring once worn by Queen Alexandra during her silent stewardship of empire, while the monarchy wavered in chaos. The ring was not ornate, but it was potent, and as it slid onto Catherine's finger, the future was sealed not by law, but by ritual. The crowd did not erupt, they absorbed, reverence overtook applause, even the cheers were tempered, restrained by awe. A coronation without crown, a queen without title, but make no mistake, this was a passing of power, not formal, but felt, not decreed, but destined. Those present would later describe the moment as transcendent, others as terrifyingly final, and one word repeated through headlines and private letters alike, inevitable. Camilla was not in attendance. Multiple sources confirmed she was denied entrance. The gates had been ordered shut the moment the guest list was finalized. No room for disruption, no seat for rejection. She watched from inside the palace, according to one aide, as if witnessing her own legacy being erased in real time. And while the public embraced the spectacle with near spiritual fervor, palace insiders knew better. This was no conclusion. It was a catalyst because yet behind the elegance and symbols, a new kind of tension had been born, and it would surface violently in the days that followed. Just as Catherine's public image soared, unseen forces moved in the shadows. Documents leaked, aides dismissed, whispers of sabotage filled the halls of Sandringham. Was this Camilla's quiet revenge or something darker brewing within the monarchy itself? The public believed the storm had passed. The ritual of the circle had calmed tempers, silenced critics, and positioned Catherine as the undeniable pillar of the monarchy's future. But behind the serene facade of royal gardens and curated headlines, the foundation had begun to crack. Without warning, private communications from Catherine's senior aides found their way into the press emails never meant for public consumption, revealing internal disagreements, logistical missteps, and hints of personal strain. It was clear someone had access. Someone wanted Catherine exposed, not just politically, but emotionally. The leak didn't come from an outsider, it came from within. As the damage rippled through royal channels, heads began to roll. Aides long associated with Camilla's inner circle either resigned under mysterious circumstances or vanished without official explanation. One had already cleared her residence at Kensington before the leak broke. Another had booked a one-way flight to a remote estate in Scotland under a pseudonym. And then came the most damning detail, an anonymous whistleblower claiming that Camilla had held a private meeting days earlier at a countryside estate. Attendees included 2 former press officers, 1 foreign advisor, and a former intelligence contractor, previously dismissed for overreach. The purpose of the meeting, containment strategy, the source alleged, but some called it retaliation in disguise. As these shadows crept closer, Charles was forced to break protocol. A private intelligence brief landed on his desk late at night, warning of sustained internal destabilization and orchestrated disruptions targeting heir designates. It didn't name Camilla, it didn't have to, the pattern was evident. The palace, long trained in the art of denial, had begun preparing for defense. But while the walls grew tense, Catherine remained still. She refused to publicly address the leaks. She offered no defense, no accusation. In a closed-door meeting, she reportedly told staff, "Let the country see who we are in silence." Her restraint did not weaken her, it deepened her aura, where others might have panicked. Absorbed, where others shouted, she stood firm, and the public once again took note. Despite the smears, the opinion polls surged in her favor. Journalists began referring to the storm as the smear crown plot, a term that suggested guilt without a name, but everyone knew where the finger pointed. Still, the damage was not without consequence. Doubts had been seeded, even among loyalists. Cracks might have been invisible from the outside, but they ran deep, threading through council meetings, family dinners, and staff briefings. The firm was no longer moving in lockstep. Quiet. Factions had begun to form. Catherine had won the public, but in the shadows, loyalty was now a currency and betrayal a weapon. She was learning quickly and painfully that ascension was only beginning, and then, as silence once again cloaked Windsor, the king made one final move, ensuring the world knew exactly who would carry the future. In an unscheduled national broadcast, King Charles appeared before the world with eyes full of clarity and voice steady as stone. He uttered the words that would echo for generations. She is the future. The monarchy was no longer just a bloodline, it was now a vision, It was the broadcast no one saw coming. The timing, the delivery, and the message itself shattered decades of royal predictability. No advisors lined up, no family members flanking him, just Charles, direct and deliberate, facing a nation hungry for clarity. He began not with announcements, but with reflection. He spoke of legacy, not just his mother's, but institutions. He spoke of healing, of transition, of the strength that lies not in dominance but in dignity. And then, with no hesitation, he named Catherine not merely as Princess of Wales, not as a consort to the future king, but as regent in waiting. The phrase, untested in modern memory, sent tremors through every royal correspondent's pen. He made it clear, should the crown ever need to steady itself before passing to the next generation, it would rest with Catherine. He thanked Camilla briefly and formally. Her service, he said, will always be acknowledged, but there were no lingering words, no warmth in the tone. It was a graceful farewell disguised as recognition, and it didn't go unnoticed. The broadcast, barely 10 minutes in length, was more than a statement. It was redrawing of lines in permanent ink, a monarch confirming not succession, but spiritual direction. The woman he once watched from the sidelines, now entrusted with the soul of the realm. Public reaction was instantaneous. Across the United Kingdom and beyond, tears flowed, not just out of surprise, but out of catharsis. It was the validation of what many already felt, that Catherine had become something more than a royal. She had become a symbol, in polls that followed just hours later, support for her surged to unprecedented levels. Editorials declared the moment the emotional coronation. For once, the monarchy wasn't about blood, it was about belief, and yet, as the nation absorbed the moment, Catherine herself remained unseen until just before dusk. A lone figure was spotted walking through the Kensington Gardens, head lowered in thought, not triumph. It wasn't a victory march. It was a woman preparing to carry something vast, something heavy, something inevitable. By nightfall, an image quietly emerged on official platforms, the royal crest subtly revised. Just beneath the lion and unicorn, a faint emblem shimmered, a rose intertwined with initial C, no caption, no announcement, but the message was unmistakable. And as the crown shifts its weight once more, one truth remains undeniable. In a kingdom built on legacy, it is not the title that defines the future, but the woman who dares to carry it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next